Now that we got parts, we're back on the Bugeye. Now before I get going working on this thing, I just want to make mention of a couple of things about the modifications. Now I am not cutting on the owner of the car because he did not build it. So he had nothing to do with these modifications. But this is not the way to do this. These flares here are put on to the bonnet and the quarters without any of the original wheel lips cut out. So the original lip is right here. And we can see right here, the tire has been hitting on this because of the wider tires. And it is chunking these tires up, tearing the sidewalls up, at least on this one corner here. So if you're going to do flares, do it properly. Cut the wheel wells out larger and then make the flares go big enough so you have the proper clearance for whatever tire you're going to run. And the other thing, which is not exactly ideal, is this car has spacers and then still has just 5-inch wide tires now, or 5-inch wide wheels, but then this tire is almost 6.5-inch wide tread width. So at the end of the day, he's probably not actually getting more traction with this tire than he would with a 195 or a 185 even. This is a 205 because the tire is wider than the wheel, which means you're going to be, your tire's going to be bowed a little bit this way, and it's not going to be sitting flat on the surface. Now actually, if you notice right here, this is actually where I believe this is catching, and the chunking on the outside of the tire is from this catching. So that's not too great, but it is what it is. I think if he went to a slightly smaller tire, he could alleviate that problem in this situation. All right, so when I started bleeding the brakes on this thing, before I decided that we're gonna have to put a new master cylinder on it, I was getting nothing out of the rear at all. One of the problems was the rear brake line here had been crushed here and here from this car being towed either on a flatbed, them hooking, or on a trailer with them putting a chain around it or something. Not terribly uncommon, I see that all the time. But then once I changed this out, I still got nothing on either side because the rear brake hose was just plugged solid. Now this is something I see surprisingly often. Fairly new front lines, but then really old rear hose on them. People can see the front and they change those out and they don't think about even looking at the rear. And this thing is plugged solid, couldn't get no fluid. So then when I found out, as soon as I got fluid to the rear, I could not get any kind of pedal, even forcing fluid through there and accounting for the problem with the master cylinder, we still were getting no pedal at all. One of the problems we got is this drum here is warped. As you turn it, it gets really hard and then it gets really easy. So this thing's warped. So when it's off the brake shoes, it's really easy to turn. When it's on the brake shoes, it gets really hard. You cannot properly adjust rear brakes with a warped brake drum. You will always get a soft, low pedal height, because if you adjust it up any higher than this, then the brake just gets hot and it wears out the shoes. Yet when you apply the brakes, it's actually still got a lot of travel because it's actually technically kind of forcing the drum round while you're doing it. But you would normally feel a little pulsation in the brakes with warped brakes, but you often don't with the rear because they do so much less of the work. Now the other side, it's adjusted as far as it can go, and we still can't get it adjusted far enough to get it close enough to the drums to actually get a decent pedal. So we got a super low pedal in this car. So the fix for that, what we're going to do on this one, brake drums are cheap. Shoes are cheap on these. We're just going to put drums and shoes on it. Since this one's already warped anyway, just do new ones on both sides. Now if you're pulling a drum off and it feels like it starts to move and then gets really hard and won't slide off, then what it is you need to back the adjuster down. You should back the adjuster down just as a matter of course, but what can happen is you can get wear or rust creating a lip here, and then they'll hang on the drum, and even though it'll spin easy, it won't come off. So if you just back the adjuster all the way down, or just back it down a bit depending on which style you got, it can make it a lot easier to pop them off. But they can get stuck on here too, in this lip here, and be really hard to get off for that first 1/4 inch. You know, like the early Spridgets, along with the MGAs and like the TD, TF, all those, and a lot of other British cars from the same time period had these style adjusters here. You turn it clockwise to adjust it up, and counterclockwise to adjust them, to back them off. And you adjust them through this hole in the brake drum. Now there's supposed to be a rubber plug in this hole, which wasn't in on this one. And you'll notice that on the factory wheels, at least like on the MGA and stuff, there will actually be a hole in the wheel that, and if you put the wheel on there correctly, you can line it up right to that hole. Then you can make adjustments to that without actually having to take the whole wheel off. You can just take the center hubcap off and go in there and adjust it. Now you can't so much on these because this rubber plug, you're not going to be able to get that rubber plug out through the wheel. So in the case of this car, it does look like both sides, like nobody's been in this thing for quite some time. They're pretty grungy inside there. Now, I do see a little bit more meat on the shoes than I expected to find, but like I said, there's not that much adjustment in these. Maybe those drums have been turned and they're a little bit bigger than stock, which is why we're showing as much on there as we are. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to actually measure the brake drum. These are 7-inch drums, so they're supposed to be, I think, exactly 7 inches when they're brand new, which new ones actually measure slightly under that. But this is one way you can tell real quick if you have a set of calipers like I do. And they actually have brake drum calipers. These won't be the most accurate because they won't have, you might get into the rough surface here a little bit, and it might actually be bigger than what I'm measuring. But you get this in here and you measure it to where you get the longest measurement that it'll read. And that'll be straight across. So I'm at 7032, 33 range. So these have already been cut in the past at least 15 thousandths. So with no more adjustment than these early cars have, that explains why we can't get any more adjustment out of it, because they've been turned enough that they're bigger than they should be. And just for a comparison, here's the new ones. One of the new ones. We're actually at about 92. You know, 699, you know. So about 8 to 9 thousandths under 7 inches. So now I got the new TRW master cylinder. So let's see what happens when I try to bleed this one. I've already put a little bit of fluid in it. So let's see. Sucking the fluid right down just like it's supposed to be. This one's going to work. Since I went through actually putting the master cylinder on and adjusting the rods in the last video, I'm not getting into that on this one. Same thing with actually doing the rear brakes. I've already done that in a previous video, so I didn't do that again on this video. I really wanted to talk about the problems specific to this car rather than actually just showing doing brakes. If you guys want me to do a better in-depth video on just doing brakes, I'll do a dedicated video on that at some point. Now, when it comes to the clutch side of this, like I said, we ended up having to change out the push rod. Now, this push rod here does have a little bit of wear in the end, but it's not that bad. But when you get a lot of wear in the end, that can make a difference on how clean you hit the gears, because they don't move that much. And any slop in this can reduce the amount of throw in the clutch. But in this case here, this is a 1275. He's got the rib cage transmission and he's got a 1275 slave cylinder. But this was not the push rod for the 1275. This was for the 1098. Here's the 1275 push rod. You can see the difference there. So it was actually bottoming out or fully extending against the circlip that's in the slave cylinder before we were getting full throw to release the clutch properly. So the longer push rod fixes that. And the other issue we have is these clevis pins here. You can see how much wear, this is the brake side, but you can see how much wear was in that. That, especially on the clutch, can make a big difference on the clutch feel and whether you get a good shift or not. So I put new ones in. They're not actually the ones with the little clips. I don't have those in stock, and these are way more expensive because of that. So I just did like the later style ones, which is just like the MGA and stuff has. One of the problems you can have is people tend to forget to actually lubricate these with grease before they put them in. So then they really wear out fast, and they can wear the end of the pedal. The hole in the end of the pedal gets sloppy, and this one here does have a bit of slop in the end of the pedals. So that little bit of slop translates the clutch is much worse because it gets used more. But that is from the wear within the clutch. Also, part of it's the bushing up here too. As you can actually see it move a little bit here. So some of that is in the bushing there being a little bit wore out. But that, in order to get rid of that, you need to replace that bushing and then either replace the whole clutch pedal or weld and re-drill the very end of the clutch pedal where the clevis pin goes through. So at this point, I've done a quick initial bleed to both the clutch and the slave just by putting some pressure on top of the master cylinder, going to the corners and blending them out. Now, I still like to do the old school manual bleed of somebody pumping the pedal while I'm bleeding, but I don't have that right now. That'll have to wait till tomorrow. At this point, the clutch is really close. Probably got a little bit of a bubble yet in there, and there's a trick to getting that out, but it takes two people to do that. And the brake pedal is much better than it was, but still not where I want it. But I still only have initial adjustment on the shoes. And I do like to wear them in just a little bit and then do a final adjustment on them. And I have taken one little drive in it, but tomorrow morning I'll take another little drive in it, and I'll have some help tomorrow to do a final bleed, so then I'll finish it then. So after doing a proper brake bleed on that thing the next day, I had a pedal height that was way better than what we had. Not quite where I'd like to see it, but no matter how much I bled it, I couldn't get it any better than that. But when the owner came to pick it up, he was actually pretty happy with it. And he's going to do some additional work to the car himself because it's going to need real wheel cylinders put in it. And we found a problem with the front calipers. Front caliper one was hanging up and not releasing properly. So we'll see what he gets after he does all that. But meanwhile, at this point, he seemed to be a happy customer. So we're on to some new projects. And as always, if you like what I'm doing, give me a thumbs up, like, subscribe, share with your friends. MG Rob, later.